Hey internets, so you may have heard of Doge, that Department of Government Efficiency that everyone seems to be talking about. For those few not clued in, Doge was established by Donald Trump through executive order as a sort of temporary department which has Elon Musk as its senior advisor, and the goal of the department can be basically summarized as afuera light. The point of it is to go through the federal government and cut things that the current administration doesn't like. The point isn't really to abolish the government, but its claim goal, the stated goal, is to cut things by at least $2 trillion. And so the praxis of this is that Doge audits various institutions and tries to find things like DEI programs or redundant regulations, or in some cases funding for scientific research that has a partisan bias to it, or foreign aid programs like USAID being abused as a form of partisan influence peddling. And Doge's goal is just kind of cut that stuff out of the budget. TLDR, the point is to cut waste. Honestly, pretty straightforward. Now, of course, the obvious problem is that Republicans and Democrats don't agree with each other at all on what exactly constitutes wasteful spending that needs to be cut. And as a result of this, along with the fact that much of the mainstream media is just partisan hacks, a lot of the information surrounding Doge and what specifically it's doing and what it has done is in fact nothing more than some really stupid propaganda. And some of the propaganda is really blatant too. For example, sometimes the same people who are cheering on judges who are blocking Doge from doing its job will often turn around and be the same people trying to say that Doge should be ended because it hasn't found enough fraud or waste to cut. Seems like an awful strange coincidence there, isn't it? Or a similar one is that the people making this complaint that Doge should be ended because it's not cutting anything will then flip around and say that Doge is very dangerous to our democracy and is destroying America and that Elon Musk has couped the government. Which, of course, is obviously silly because both those narratives can't be true. And yet, they're strangely often coming from the same people. So yeah, that's what the purpose of this video is going to be. I'm going to be going over some useful sources where you can actually check what Doge is doing, but mainly going to be refuting a lot of the bad takes on Doge. Because the degree by which I've found that a lot of journos are being dishonest in regards to what Doge is actually doing is some of the worst and most biased press we've seen in years. But first of all, this video is sponsored by private internet access. In my honest opinion, VPNs are absolutely necessary to take advantage of all the internet has to offer in a way that keeps your data safe and secure. Whether it's from hackers trying to steal your passwords and identity, your internet service provider, the prying eyes of the surveillance state, or from copyright trolls seeking to harass you, using the internet without a VPN lets them see everything. It's like going into combat without any armor and just hoping you don't get hit. A generally bad idea. And a VPN solves this and protects your personal data by masking your IP online. And in the case of private internet access, rerouting your traffic through RAM-only servers that have a strict no-logs policy that has been proven in court, which is just one of the many reasons I've been using them as my go-to VPN for over a year, and I've always been impressed with the features and how well private internet access just works. And it can be used for a lot of things other than just security. For instance, it allows you to access region-restricted content. A lot of streaming services and online stores block or restrict their content or show you different deals depending on where in the world you're connecting from. And private internet access helps you get around this by having servers in all 50 US states and 91 other countries. It's also available on all platforms, whether that be Linux, Windows, Android, Mac, iOS, whatever. And with a single subscription, you can use it with an unlimited number of devices at the same time. It also fully supports peer-to-peer file sharing, which brings me to my personal favorite feature, which is that it's fast. They don't throttle you for torrenting or anything like that. It's also extremely affordable, and by using my personal link, you get an 83% discount for just $2.03 a month, with 4 months free when you use my link, all with a 30-day money-back guarantee to boot. So check private internet access out. I highly recommend it. But anyways, first off, a big problem is that there's so much disinformation regarding Doge and so much biased takes out there that the first thing we have to go over here is exactly where the heck you can find reliable information on what Doge is doing. Because this is unfortunately another one of those cases where mass media has been so biased about it that even the Wikipedia article isn't exactly a very good source. Because again, all Wikipedia really does is take standard liberal media and then regurgitates whatever the average narrative of that media is. I've kind of gone over this about Wikipedia before. The issue with Wikipedia is that it relies more on journalist secondary opinion sources than primary evidence. And so when a lot of journo takes about a certain subject aren't very good, the unfortunate result is that the Wikipedia article isn't very good. Although it's not quite that bad, it's not as bad as the Wikipedia article on Gamergate, for example. In fact, most of the stuff on the Doge page for Wikipedia is mostly true. It's just not a very good compilation of what actually matters. It goes into a lot of fluff and nonsense that nobody should really care about, like this Doge Kids section, where they're whining about too many people between the ages of 19 to 24 working for Doge because Wired and CNN made us think about it. it. But in reality, this is just not a significant thing. It's just journos who don't like Doge because they don't like the current administration, looking for something to nitpick about. But in the grand scheme of things, it's really just bread and circus. Oh my god, didn't you hear that Doge has some 22-year-old code monkeys working for it? This is very dangerous to our democracy. Which of course is ridiculous, and as a result of that, much of the article comes across as deeply unserious. It's just kind of random fluff that doesn't really give you any kind of insight into what this department is doing. There's a little bit of information, but not enough. What you probably want, or at least what I wanted, was a source of information that goes over specifically what Doge is cutting. Just a simple, flat list of things that Doge has found and recommended that the federal government cut out. A lot of media coverage surrounding Doge has been a lot of pedantry about how Doge is doing things, rather than what they are doing. You know, whether or not they've followed the proper bureaucratic procedures and crossed their T's and dotted their I's correctly or whatnot. The kind of crap that the average intelligent person doesn't give a cactus divided by catbutt about. So here are some better sources of information that tell you what Doge is actually doing, as opposed to just procedural fluff. Now, the most useful source I found is actually on Polymarket. There is a polymarket.com/Doge, and what's useful about it is that it just kind of lists the primary data and lets you figure it out. And it does so in a way that isn't really pushy. It's not really trying to tell you a narrative. It's just, hey, here's the numbers, and here's what they're doing, and here's what they're cutting. So for instance, it's got the taxpayer dollars saved, it's got the percentage bar of the $2 trillion goal, along with the count of the initiatives and how many days it's been since the thing's been going on. And it even has a calendar where you can hover over each specific day and see specific initiatives that Doge called into question. And then you can locate the specific documents for that day by selecting the date range in the initiative filters. So let's say I want to see some more specific details on what exactly happened between February 10th and February 12th in Doge. We can select that as our date range, go through a few things, and then start digging. And yes, you can click on any one of these for additional details. And this just kind of allows us to ask questions by thinking for ourselves, rather than, you know, relying on some journo to try and do that for us. And you can then start asking some questions like, why the heck does the USDA Food and Nutrition Service need $25 million for DEI training? I mean, even if you agree with DEI, that seems a little bit excessive. Just a little bit sus. Or why is it in general that USA just seems to like to spend hundreds of millions of billions of dollars on just random stuff? Why are we funneling millions of dollars to overseas journalists? I mean, sure, individually they're not being paid that much, but you can quickly see when going through this that this stuff all adds up. Government bureaucrats spend a lot of money on just random influence peddling. Like this one right here. Do we really need to be giving tens of millions of dollars for Chemonics International to be doing for-profit business in Libya? A legitimate business shouldn't need US aid to do that. And honestly, in many ways, this isn't too surprising. I mean, those of us on the libertarian right have been saying this for years. Much of what the government does is just wasteful spending and influence peddling and just abusing the fact that they don't have a voluntary relationship with taxpayers, which allows politicians to just kind of throw money at whatever programs they think will give them more power, regardless of whether or not any sane person would ever voluntarily give them the money to do that. And so Polymarket is a very good source that just kind of links directly to the primary data and lets you go through things and start asking these questions yourself. Another good source if you want just some more general, easy to watch curated information is actually Nick's Doge Watch playlist. Some of you may remember that I've actually appeared on his show before, and his podcasting team has done a pretty good job compiling just some basic information on what Doge is doing and what's happening around it and various Supreme Court rulings on it. Just some general good highlights if you don't want to take the effort to actually dig through Polymarket, because it can be a little bit boring, admittedly, to dig through those things if you're not really interested in it. So if you just want to laugh at highlights of the silliest and dumbest things that are going around surrounding Doge, you want a more entertaining way to look at things, then this is a pretty good source for that. And lastly is just Doge's main website. Doge.gov is a thing, it does exist. It's not quite as usable as Polymarket in terms of being able to search and look through things, but it does exist, and it does accomplish mostly the same function. But anyways, let's move on to actually refuting some of the misinformation surrounding Doge. Starting with some rhetoric. A lot of politicians and journos are just using their standard snarl words to avoid admitting that they don't like what Doge is doing, but at the same time, they don't really have a principled way of calling out what Doge is doing. So they're using loaded language to hide the truth. The first of these is calling Doge an illegal power grab. And this just comes from a very disingenuous interpretation of what the phrase power grab means. Because yes, technically Doge is taking power away from various government institutions, but it's not actually giving that power to anybody else. In fact, if you want to be honest with the phrase power grab and how the average layman would colloquially interpret that phrase, Doge is intentionally crafted to not be a power power grab. Doge is designed to be a temporary agency for discovering government things to cut out, and the reason it's temporary is so that it itself cannot be abused later on down the road if, say, some authoritarians were to gain control of it, which is actually genius. And so when politicians and their Journo allies are saying the phrase power grab, they're just intentionally not saying the full line, which is that we're upset because power is being taken away from us. But that, of course, is not how most people conceive of the idea of a power grab. The general public doesn't view that as a power grab. That's not how an honest person interprets the phrase. So the logic that these journos and politicians are using can be effectively used against any cutting of government spending. They're just using the phrase power grab in place of cutting government spending. It's just their way of making a completely innocuous thing sound like it's a bad thing somehow. And then there's some similar rhetoric from Chuck Schumer, where he goes by the rhetoric that no one's elected Elon Musk and even suggests that Doge is somehow a shadow government, which again is just a very silly, obvious lie. Doge is not cutting government spending and then giving that money to itself. That's not how the department functions. But if you were to take Chuck Schumer's rhetoric at its face value, that's how a normal person might interpret it. It's also just completely hypocritical and nonsensical in regards to how the United States government agencies actually function. The vast, overwhelming majority of government bureaucrats are not elected. And much of Chuck Schumer's political track record is just that, throwing people's tax dollars at government bureaucracy, like trying to set up bureaucrats to regulate Bitcoin, because some people use it for the illegal drug trade. Never mind the fact that people use regular money for illegal drug trade as well, and never mind the fact that nobody working for the regulatory bodies that would be in charge of facilitating that would be elected either. The reality is that every single US president and every single US senator has had unelected people within their ring of influence, and that this is actually how the US government actually works, because the United States is supposed to be a representative democracy, not a true direct democracy. Everyone with even basic knowledge of the US political system knows this, including, of course, Chuck Schumer. Like, for the example, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee chair is appointed by none other than Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. And so Chuck Schumer obviously does not actually hold any kind of principled position against unelected people having influence on the United States government. He doesn't actually believe what he's saying. He's just saying nobody elected Elon Musk because it rhetorically sounds better than I don't like Elon Musk, which is what he would say if he were honest. But of course, at the same time, if he were to actually be honest and say that he just doesn't like Elon Musk and that's the reason why he's throwing his little cow fit, well then no one would care what he has to say. So instead he has to fearmonger and take advantage of people's ignorance through this lie by implication that the relationship that Donald Trump has with Elon Musk is somehow some kind of new thing. Like this is some kind of uniquely corrupt situation, when it absolutely is not. And if his contention is that Elon Musk is part of a private business, just a quick look at Schumer's open secret page shows that he's in bed with a whole bunch of private companies as well. All of these sectors of the economy, which Chuck Schumer has millions of dollars of business with, include people from the private sector who nobody elected. Is all of this a shadow government too? The whole thing is just completely absurd, which becomes obvious when you look at certain things that have been going on lately. For instance, every single Democrat voted against Rand Paul's initiative to cut government spending by $1.5 trillion. And Chuck Schumer has a pretty stable track record on always voting for government spending. In fact, he was one of the Democrats who split with his party to vote for the GOP bill to go through so that the government could keep on spending. And so he's just another politician who thinks that government spending is the way to do everything. Doge is saying no, and he doesn't like that. So the reason Schumer is wording his whining this way is because he knows he can't be honest and say the Doge is reducing the government spending and that he doesn't like that because he doesn't care about the national debt and the inflation caused by his reckless spending on taxpayer dime. So instead, he tries to gaslight the general public by accusing Doge of doing what he is in fact doing. Chuck Schumer is the stereotypical corrupt politician who uses government bureaucracy and slush funds to give preferential treatment to his political allies and kickback to his biggest donors. And he is just butt mad that Doge is reducing his ability to maintain his gravy train. But of course, he can't say that, so instead he resorts to snarl language and rhetoric. No one elected Elon Musk. Doge is a shadow government. This is very dangerous to our democracy. Wah, wah, wah. All smoke and mirrors. Notice, seize, remove, cleanse. He has nothing of value to say. This is honestly a kind of a common theme with Chuck Schumer. This strategy of accusing others of doing what he is doing and holding people to standards that he doesn't hold himself to. I personally like to call it the get away with being a corrupt politician by pretending to have no sense of self-awareness strategy. Something that seems to unfortunately be quite common. But I think the weirdest thing about this whole narrative that exposing government spending as corrupt and fraudulent is somehow a danger to our democracy is the fact that it's just not even really true. Because people did, in fact, vote for this. Trump ran on tax cuts, and you need to cut government waste in order to have tax cuts actually matter. And people voted for Donald Trump. And so that's another kind of funny thing with this rhetoric, is that it's kind of disconnected from the reality of how different voter bases are looking at it. So we have journos whining about Doge, whining about how it's unelected, and then you have people to the right looking at what Doge is doing and thinking to themselves, this is exactly what I voted for. An ActiVote poll shows that most Republicans supported the creation of Doge. In fact, most people supported the creation of Doge. Republicans supported Doge by 80 to 11%, Democrats opposed it by 60 to 30%, but independents supported it by 50 to 39%. So a department that cuts government spending that people voted for and people democratically supported is somehow a danger to our democracy. The whole thing is just completely absurd. Not only is this just dumb rhetoric, not only is it just snarl words and fear-mongering from the people who don't like what's going on, it's not even based on truth. Even if you take their rhetoric at face value, it's all just blatantly 100% untrue. So let's move on to something else. Those of us who are aware of how the journalist misinformation spin jobs happen, if you know how it works, you know that a very common one is lying by omission, but another thing related to that is lying by amplification, which is something I've seen a few publications do in regards to Doge. Specifically, a few journalists are nitpicking at a few errors that Doge has made and then using that to imply that the entire operation is incompetent. This is ridiculous because studies have shown that any financial institution that deals with billions of dollars is going to have a number of accounting errors. It's just expected. There are a multitude of studies out there confirming this. When you have an institution that is in charge of billions of dollars and they have to do accounting for it, there's a percentage of errors. Every 100 pages of ledger or so, there's going to be a couple discrepancies. And so naturally, when you have an organization set up to go through thousands of these things on a weekly freaking basis, there's going to be some discrepancies there. For example, this article from Forbes, which rambles on about a few of these issues. In this, we see that Doge incorrectly listed $8 billion canceled for some ICE technical support for the Office of Diversity and Civil Rights. And they made this mistake because it was originally valued at $8 billion, but then it was later updated to be only $8 million, which was apparently a mistake originally made by them when they first made the contract. So in other words, the DHS screwed up and then Doge screwed up by repeating their screw up, but they then later corrected it to $5.5 million. Now, sure, this is a mistake, but things like this aren't actually that uncommon. For example, a Gartner survey showed that over half of accountants make errors like this several times per month, usually every week. It would actually be very unusual for you to not be able to find Doge making occasional errors like this, especially when there's a discrepancy within the original documentation. And that's something I think a lot of people don't realize. It's very, very easy to nitpick at a financial institution, and from a journalist's perspective, then drastically over-report it. In order for this to mean anything, they would need to show that they have an above-average error rate in comparison to similar agencies. And so I decided to check into any of these journalists have actually done the work to check if the error rate of Doge compared to similar institutions handling the same number of financial documents and ledgers and whatnot is significantly higher than average. And the answer is no, none of them have done that work. That's just not a thing they've done. Which means their analysis isn't actually based on any real standard. They're instead trying to hold Doge to an unrealistic, unreasonable perfectionist standard that even the best financial institutions on the planet wouldn't be able to pass. And of course, the journos know exactly what they're doing. And so what these journalists from various places like the New York Times or Politico or CBS News or of course Forbes, like I just went over, what they're really just doing is they're just nitpicking. They dislike Doge for political reasons, and so they're looking for information to say that Doge is being handled incompetently. But the problem is, without that wide-ranging study, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't prove anything. You can take this level of nitpicking against any financial institution in an attempt to imply that they're being run by a bunch of incompetent monkeys. But in reality, it's just a lie by amplification. It doesn't mean anything. The only thing that would be worrying is if Doge didn't try to correct some of its errors, which Doge does do. They do try to correct the errors that they make. And so all the journos have really proven here is that Doge isn't perfect. Well, duh, of course they're not perfect. Nobody who understands financial institutions and accounting expects perfection. Human error happens in places like these all the freaking time. So it's correct, but pedantically, or as the quote I'm going for with this video is, often the surest way to convey misinformation is to tell the strict truth, from Mark Twain. It is very, very, very easy for a dishonest person to nitpick at true data and true information, and then take that data out of context and report it in a way that is disingenuous. So while what all of these articles are saying is rooted in some level of truth, what they're trying to imply, which is that Doge is uniquely incompetent, well, they haven't actually proven that. They're just pretending to via the nitpick fallacy. This is especially true when you consider the fact that a lot of the information that Doge is going through is information that contains errors to begin with. And the funniest of these has to be the whole $50 million to Gaza thing. So the original claim from Doge was that we were were sending $15 million of aid to Gaza for condoms for Hamas. And this turned out to be not true, and so of course the media pounced on it and called Musk a liar. Now, the truth of the matter is that from 2016 to 2022, the government spent over $100 million for quote-unquote family planning for over 60 different countries. And so it just kind of ignores the question, should US aid be being used to spend millions of dollars of money on condoms for foreign countries? Is that something that the United States taxpayer should be subsidizing? But the media instead decided to laser focus for some weird reason on, oh, Doge got it wrong, it's not going to Gaza, and completely ignoring the more important question. Sure, Doge got the details of where specifically the aid was going to wrong, but the overall big picture of the problem has not been solved. Why is the United States taxpayer being forced to finance contraceptives and other family planning in other countries? I don't know about you, but I think that sounds like a pretty obvious waste of money that you'd want to cut, right? But of course, none of the media are asking that question. None of them are actually looking at the big picture. They're just looking at whatever they can find in terms of Doge errors that they can be pedantic about. It is very, very stupid. So let's move on to the next thing to refute, which is the claim that Doge has not found any fraud. This is a disturbingly common journo argument in relation to how obviously dumb it is. Because all it is just an equivocation fallacy. It's just dancing between a very strict legal definition of fraud and what your average rational person would consider fraud. Because technically, in a very strict legal sense, no government spending, no matter how obviously based on corruption or absurd or deranged the reasoning behind it may be, is considered, again, in a very strict legal sense to be quote-unquote fraud, so long as it follows proper procedures and gets the right stamps of approval from the right bureaucrats at the right time, etc., etc. So it's another one of those silly arguments that deliberately muddies the water between what is considered legal and what is considered moral. As a right-leaning libertarian, I could do the very same thing in reverse. Because technically, if you're a Mises libertarian, then any form of government spending is considered to be fraud, within the context of how we define fraud. In a strict Mises Institute sense, any government spending is considered fraud because it's extracted from taxpayers in a non-voluntary manner, aka taxation is theft. And so on the question of whether or not Doge has found any fraud, what we should really be doing is instead considering, okay, what would most people consider to be fraud? What's a less partisan definition of fraud? And the answer is that most people, whether they're left or right-wing or whatever, can probably agree that a private company receiving subsidies as a result of a politician that they have a lobbying and revolving door relationship with, that's something most people would consider to be fraud. So a so-called democracy-based government using taxpayer dollars to enrich their political allies while ignoring the reasons that voters voted for them. From what I've seen, most people, regardless of political affiliation or ideology, agree that that is generally something you can consider to be fraudulent. So has Doge found any of that? And the answer is yes, they have. In fact, they've found so much of this that it's not even that difficult to find it on your own. Like, for example, right here, $15 million with Tetra Tech through US aid for South Africa. And oh look, their lobbying activities are high enough to have a profile on Open Secrets. And here's the thing, this took me less than 5 minutes to find. All I did was go to the polymarket/Doge site and filter by US aid, and just click through a few random documents. So if you want to say that Doge has not found any fraud, then you're relying on a very, very strict definition of fraud that no reasonable person uses on a day-to-day basis. Just because cronyism is technically illegal in a sense, doesn't mean that your average person thinks that cronyism is a good thing. If I were to go downtown to Portland University and were to ask random Portland students if they think that cronyism should be considered a form of fraud, the vast majority of them would say yes. And so saying that, oh, Doge hasn't technically found any fraud based on this very strict legal definition, it's just not honest reporting. It's another thing that just comes across as very deeply unserious and very blatantly disingenuous. Especially considering how a lot of the journos I'm seeing that are using this argument are publications who have called this corruption out in the past. But now they're turned around and saying, oh, well, the corruption was properly filed and according to procedure, so therefore it's not fraud. I mean, just how much of a partisan hack journoid does one have to be in order to try and unironically make this argument? So let's move on to something a little bit more interesting, some more specific Breadtube schlop. We'll start from this one from Destiny. Destiny laughs at so-called fraud receipts released by Doge. I'll just roll this clip.
These are our receipts. What would it be? Destiny, them publishing private contracts? How about them explaining how it was waste, fraud, or abuse? Is it because it has diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility assessment and training service? Does it automatically count as political pro? I just am supposed to assume that this is fraud? Or good one. Okay. Yeah, fraud is when you don't like a thing, I guess.
Yep, that is his argument. Because they didn't spell it out for him in an obvious, easy to understand manner, it therefore does not count as waste, fraud, or abuse. Now, admittedly, there is a little bit of pedantic correctness here. It is true that it would be better for Doge to include maybe a paragraph or so of explanation for why they consider what they're cutting to be wasteful spending, but the thing is that would also require a whole lot more work, when it's honestly not that difficult to read these and just come to that conclusion yourself. So I'm gonna help Destiny out a little bit here. So starting with the second article he looked at, the problem here is that the state is subsidizing Politico. When the state is allowed to dump tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars into a private media organization, you are allowing the state to choose winners and losers in the media. And so you end up with this kind of state media proxy problem, where a lot of so-called private media organizations are just state-funded news by proxy. So it's just another form of cronyism, which again, most people agree to be a form of waste, fraud, and abuse. Which is particularly funny because I've seen Destiny argue that the idea that there are state media proxies is a conspiracy theory, and yet here he is staring at objective evidence that it's not a conspiracy theory. And his eyes just kind of gloss over it. It's not explained to me in an obvious manner why it's fraud, therefore it's not fraud. Good job, Destiny. Nice personal incredulity fallacy. They didn't make it obvious for you, therefore it's not happening. And on the first document went over, yes, diversity, equity, inclusion training should be considered wasteful spending. That's just the state pushing ideology on taxpayer dime. There was actually a relatively recent meta-analysis back in 2021 on prejudice reduction, found that the effect of DEI programs on behavior is nearly zero. And not only that, but beliefs to the contrary are largely the results of publication bias. And honestly, just logically, from a rational perspective, it's kind of an open secret at this point that wokery and DEI that goes along with it is just a secular religion. It's preaching and influence peddling on taxpayer dime. Even if you agree with what it's preaching, the reality is there's no good evidence that it increases financial efficiency. And of course, there's just the moral question, should taxpayers who do not agree with that ideology be forced to subsidize training for that ideology? Just imagine an ideology that you don't like, then imagine a zealot holding a gun to your head forcing you to fund that ideology. Congratulations, you now understand why this counts as waste, fraud, and abuse. So let's move on to some more schlop. I see the Breadtube Reddit has reposted this video from Richard Wolff, where Wolff argues that billionaires are robbing us because public employees are losing their jobs. Here's just a simple clip of the reasoning.
Okay, what Trump and Musk are doing is cutting taxes. How are they doing it? By laying off millions of public employees who, if you don't have to pay them, well, then you don't have to raise the taxes. All of that money that we would have to raise in taxes to pay for them, we don't have to anymore. And we'll go to the American people and say, look, who cares about all those public employees who lost their jobs? I am able to say to you, we will not raise your taxes.
Now, of course, the issue with Richard Wolff's reasoning here is that it's just based on pure economic illiteracy. Yeah, sure, some public employees will lose their jobs in the event of being cut out in order for tax cuts to happen. The problem is this just completely ignores the fact that the private sector is better at job creation than the public sector. And it's just kind of a known fact that lower taxes provide incentive for more private sector job creation. So he's saying that we should feel sorry for these public workers losing their jobs, as those jobs get lost when they're identified as government waste. But this ignores the fact that they could get better jobs from the private sector, you know, jobs that actually rely on voluntary monetary transactions rather than being funded by the state on taxpayer dime. It's like Richard Wolff is just completely ignoring the problem of taxation here, and also just completely ignoring how job creation happens. Let's just do a simple, quick comparison. From roughly 2010 to 2019, government spending and revenue as a percentage of GDP was around 35 to 40%. And yet, if you compare private and public job creation on, say, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, you'll notice that the private sector far outpaces this in relation to how much the government is spending. In general, the private sector has a net job gain of 10 to 1. And so Richard Wolff wants to play the empathy argument here. Oh, we should feel sorry for these public employees losing their jobs. But the reality is that money could have been better spent in the private sector on 10 more jobs. So it's a very ridiculous attempt at appealing to emotions, because the emotion that it's appealing to is one that doesn't even make sense. If unemployment equals sadness, then you should be happy that we're shifting more job growth to the private sector. as it solves the unemployment problem you're complaining about better than the public sector. And really, just in general, little things like this kind of show how the only real arguments against Doge are just authoritarianism. A lot of the arguments I've seen against Doge to me seem to mostly just be bootlickers mad because they have less boots to lick, which is really sad because it all just kind of drowns out the one legitimate criticism of Doge that I've seen, which is that the real problem with Doge is that it's not going hard enough. What Doge should also be looking at is that it should be an agency that looks over what we call quote-unquote mandatory spending and thinks of ways of how we can privatize the organizations that money is going to. If Doge really wants to trim the fat, it should actually increase the scope of the finances it's looking at. But overall, Doge is doing a pretty good job, even if it's just baby steps. Defunding instances of DEI programs, cronyism, removing bureaucrats who don't need to be there from their positions, as well as just no longer funding genderqueer dance theory in Zimbabwe because they couldn't find enough people to voluntarily fund that. Gee, I wonder why. It's again a step in the right direction, and a good way to tell that is just by looking at some of the arguments against Doge. The vast majority of these arguments are just stupid flailing about, mostly just rhetoric and fear-mongering, and this idea that reducing government spending is very dangerous to our democracy, which, if you need a reminder, generally the people who whine about something being dangerous to our democracy, well, they tend to mean their democracy, which is very specifically not your democracy. It's all coming from the same people who will unironically try to argue that fascism is when less government. It's honestly just pathetic. And so that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you like my content and want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, which, by the way, I've got some Doge-related merch up, which is currently on a limited introductory sale, and also, again, by checking out private internet access. But for now, that is all. Thanks again for watching. Till next time.